And we're rolling. What's up, Sean? How are you doing?
Hi, Travis. Great to be with you.
Yes, with a name like John Turner, I feel like you could fit right in with these pilgrims.
Well, there was a John Turner on the Mayflower, but he and his sons didn't survive the first winter, so I can't claim descent from him. Unfortunately, that would really help my cachet as a historian of Plymouth Colony.
Yeah, that would look real good on the book jacket. Well, I mean, let's just dive in. I mean, first of all, this is crazy to me. I've been researching that this was only 400 years ago.
Yeah. So yeah, if you think about it, that's an enormous chunk of time. If you went back 400 years farther, right, that would be 1220. You'd be in smack dab in the middle of the Middle Ages. And people tend to think about the United States as a young country that, obviously hasn't even been in existence for 250 years. But the Pilgrims only take us, that only takes us back 400 years. So it's, still a pretty short breadth of human history.
Yeah, it's just remarkable because I don't know. I've been learning about others, Mayan civilization and stuff like that, and this is just 400 years ago. It's just I don't know. I'm getting held up on that. It just blows my mind. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, let's dive into this. So first of all, your book. Congrats on your book. It's called "They Knew
thanks.
They Were Pilgrims: Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty." So why title it "They Knew They Were Pilgrims"?
So that comes from a quote from William Bradford's History of Plymouth Colony. Bradford became the governor of Plymouth Colony sort of toward the end of the first winter when everything was a big disaster. And he wrote a year by year history of the colony. And that phrase, they knew they were pilgrims, it's from a spot in the history when he's describing the Pilgrims' departure from the Netherlands. They were in the Netherlands prior to coming to the New World. And the context is these people weren't sure where their earthly destination would be, and they weren't sure whether things would go well for them or not. But they knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on these things, but lifted their eyes up to the heavens, which would be their eventual destination. So by that, he simply meant they were pilgrims on a spiritual journey that included their time on earth, but would ultimately conclude with their passage to the presence of God in heaven. And they became known as the Pilgrims in the early 19th century, so about 200 years ago. Americans started referring to this group of colonists as the Pilgrims.
Okay.
They didn't call themselves that. As far as they were concerned, the New Testament um, essentially used that label of pilgrim for any Christian. And so they understood themselves in that way.
Oh, okay, interesting. And I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I had to look up, exactly what the definition of pilgrim was. And well, why don't, can you elaborate on what that is?
Well, what did you find? Tell me, Travis.
It was, I don't want to mess it up here, but it was uh, specifically related to religion, like looking for moving somewhere because of your religious beliefs.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's probably most associated with making pilgrimages to a particular religious site.
Okay.
So um, there are a lot of prominent shrines and cathedrals and churches in Europe and elsewhere to which people made pilgrimages. So Canterbury is a famous example in England.
Right.
Pilgrims from around England and elsewhere would travel there because the bones of a saint were buried there. So pilgrims are often used in that context, and you can still take that sort of pilgrimage in many places in Europe and elsewhere. But the people that we know as the pilgrims in American history, they were using it in a different sense, simply of men and women being on this spiritual pilgrimage that always included uncertain times on earth. These people didn't, they didn't have the expectation that things would always go well for them,
Hmm.
but they had that ultimate assurance about their eternal destinies, I think.
Yeah, because that's kind of something that's important to understand, to kind of understand why they're doing all this, is that these pilgrims were, it's kind of crazy looking at what they did, but they weren't really that afraid of death, really, to leave earth, because they thought they were going to go to a better, their afterlife or whatever. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say that they absolutely didn't fear death, because I think most people of faith, even if they have that belief, you know, people still fear things on Earth,
Sure.
because life on Earth can be kind of scary
Yeah, right.
and crazy. But like I said, I think they did have that ultimate assurance, and for them, they knew that founding a colony was a really risky, hazardous thing to do. I actually like to say it's one of the most foolhardy things anybody could do back in the 17th century. If you tried to start a colony somewhere, there's a pretty good chance that a third, a half, or more of the group would die within the first year.
Sure.
So you had to be motivated by something pretty strongly to do that. A lot of would-be colonists were motivated by the idea of getting wealthy quickly, which hardly ever worked out for people. And this group of colonists actually also wanted to prosper in that way, but they also had the goal of planting this religious community in the New World.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, who wouldn't want to make some money while you're doing it, you know?
Right. Sure. Well, I
um,
mean, they thought if they were successful economically, then more people who might have been on the fence about their religious principles might give them another look and might join with them.
right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I guess let's jump back a little bit and to kind of understand their motivation, because they they start off in England, but they're unhappy being there, right?
Hmm. Well, they're unhappy because they're starting to be persecuted, and the context there is that the England had a state church, the Church of England,
Right.
and it was illegal to form other churches. And even though it was maybe not strictly enforced, you were required at least to attend church occasionally and to partake of the Eucharist or Lord's Supper, at least on occasion.
Okay.
And there were plenty of reformers in England who were unhappy with various things about the Church of England. Mainly, they thought it had been not reformed enough after the Reformation. They thought the church was still too Catholic in certain ways, that priests wore sort of fancy priestly garments. Um, they used the sign of the cross. A lot of people thought that might be idolatrous. A lot of Puritan reformers, as they became known, they didn't like having a set book of prayers that ministers and priests would use during a service.
Hmm.
And there were some people, some men and women, who got so, who concluded that the Church of England was so corrupt that they had no choice but to withdraw from it and to form their own churches in which they could worship according to their own principles.
Sure.
And men and women around England, not a huge number of people, but some did this. They were known as separatists because they
Right.
separated from the Church of England. And the church would periodically crack down on these people. Several separatists in the late 1500s were hanged.
Ooh.
Some of the colonists who eventually came on the Mayflower were fined, imprisoned, things like that. And they knew that things could get worse. And so they fled England around 1608 and went to the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands,
Hmm.
where they had more religious freedom.
Okay. So that was they first went there. They're like, we got to leave England. Let's go to the Netherlands. And then what did they find there? Were they able to, did they find what they wanted there?
Well, they did really in terms of religious liberty. The Dutch Republic also had a public state supported church, but it gave considerably more freedom to religious minorities. So the separatists, these English separatists, they could form their own congregations there, and they could basically worship without being molested um, by government and church authorities for the most part.
Hmm.
Um, and so you'd think that should have just been the end of the story. And
Right.
then we wouldn't be having this conversation, which would be quite a shame, Travis.
Yeah.
Um, but after about 10 years in the city of Leiden, in the Dutch Republic, they started thinking seriously about starting a colony. And there were a few reasons for that. They weren't sure that the liberty they enjoyed in Leiden would go on forever into the future. There's the prospect of renewed war between Catholic Spain and the Dutch Republic.
Mm.
That could have been a big problem. And also, they were unhappy with other aspects of their lives in Leiden. Um, Most of these people had been farmers, in a few cases, things like grocers or printers. And in the Dutch Republic, they were mostly thrown into um, various jobs in the cloth industries of the Dutch Republic. And it was really hard work. They felt like they were growing old quickly.
Okay.
And they also didn't want their children to grow up being Dutch rather than English. They were worried that their children would drift away from their own church and would just sort of assimilate into Dutch society. And
Right.
so
Okay.
they started thinking about leaving. Couldn't go back to England, and they contemplated a number of possibilities. Going to Central South America was one possibility. Thought about going under Dutch auspices to what eventually became the area around New York. Um, got a patent from the Virginia company that had founded Jamestown and other settlements in Virginia.
Yeah.
And so their initial plan was to go to what they considered Northern Virginia. I live in what's Northern Virginia today. They met instead up by the Hudson River. And when they eventually crossed the Atlantic, they got a bit off course and ended up basically encountering the eastern shore of Cape Cod.
Right. Okay. And so that's Plymouth.
So yeah, basically they tried once they hit Cape Cod, they tried to they knew essentially roughly where they were. They tried to head to the south. It's kind of hazardous navigating around there, so they ended up sailing around the tip of Cape Cod, anchoring, exploring the area, and then settled at what became the town of Plymouth
Okay.
in what is now southeastern Massachusetts.
Right. Okay. So they're kind of like, well, we missed it, but I guess
Right.
this is good enough here.
Well, you gotta make the best of it. I mean, almost the worst thing for them is it took them, some details in the story, but it took them a long time to get going from. They returned to England simply sort of as a staging area for the departure
Okay.
to what would have been Northern Virginia. It took them a long time to get organized. They
Sure.
originally had two ships. One of them leaked so much that it had to be abandoned So it took them a long time to really leave, and they didn't leave until early September. So they didn't get to Cape Cod until it was November. And so it's essentially already winter
Sure.
back then before global warming. And
Yeah.
so that is sort of a disastrous situation to just show up on in New England with the onset of winter. That was really created circumstances in which they were going to have a very rough first winter.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. You get there, great, we're here, but damn, it's cold.
Right.
And so that was the journey on the Mayflower that we've all learned about and heard about, right?
Hmm.
And
Exactly.
yeah, and we mentioned this before, but you asked me to. There was dogs on the Mayflower.
Well, we were talking about our respective dogs. So yeah, there were two dogs on the Mayflower: a Mastiff, which is a huge dog, which I've actually never thought about the dogs too much, but I'm pretty
Right.
sure they wanted that as protection. That would be a powerful animal to have, and then a spaniel. I think they probably had chickens, might have had pigs. They didn't get livestock until a few years later.
Oh,
But
okay.
you can imagine there were 102 passengers on the Mayflower, which wasn't an enormous ship. Imagine those people and some animals below decks for 8 weeks. It would simply have been a noxious environment. But despite that, um, one crew member and one passenger died on the journey, which for early 17th century standards, is a pretty successful crossing. Um,
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I feel like at least one person dies on every Carnival cruise today, anyway.
yeah, I guess in the age of coronavirus, I'd rather be a passenger on the Mayflower than on a modern day cruise ship. But
That's true. Yeah, it's a little dark. We shouldn't talk about that. But
yeah.
okay, so no, this is great. This is kind of the story we've all heard. And then so what's uh I mean, did they really know? Okay, well, first of all, there is Jamestown has already been established in North America, and they're
Mhm.
from England, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, and they came over mostly for financial to get rich, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, hoping to find gold. Jamestown was established in 1607. You can see one main difference between the two colonies. Jamestown at first is all men. So these are folks who are looking to get rich quickly and get back to England as soon as possible. Now,
Oh, okay.
a very high percentage of the early Jamestown settlers die. And then eventually other men and then women come over. Mayflower includes families from the start.
Right.
Um, and, but yeah, I don't know. I think you were going somewhere with the question. I won't
Well, I
keep
know. Well,
going.
that was just kind of, I mean, I don't remember if I had learned that, but I don't know. I just had the perception that the colonists of Plymouth were the first kind of guys to come over to North America. But then, there were guys here 13 years before that from England.
Yeah, so I'm located in Virginia, and I think Virginians have a certain amount of pilgrim envy that, why did the pilgrims get so much attention? They weren't first. But I think that's because eventually Americans sort of latched on to the pilgrim story as, I don't know, the best way of putting it, maybe, the nicer way to begin the story of American history.
Sure.
You have people coming for religious liberty rather than to try to get rich. In Jamestown, there is violent conflict with the natives almost from the start. And things quickly devolve into warfare and massacres. In Plymouth, the crux of the traditional Thanksgiving story is two people deciding to make peace and eat together instead of fighting each other. And so if you want a more optimistic version of American origins that you might feel better about, Plymouth and the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, that has worked better for a lot of people than the story of Jamestown.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds a lot nicer. Um, yeah, so let's dive into that a bit. What was kind of like their first months or their first year when the Plymouth colonists got there? What were they doing? What were they encountering?
Sure. So, I mean, they essentially tromped around Cape Cod for a few weeks, decided that Cape Cod was not the best place to establish a settlement. Not, not great sources of fresh water. Um, Soil in terms of agriculture didn't look as promising.
Mm-hmm.
So they scout around and end up settling at Plymouth, and they get the name off of a map of New England that had been published a few years earlier. One of the interesting things about Plymouth is that it had been a large Wampanoag native settlement called Patuxet. There was a devastating epidemic that afflicted a number of the native peoples of southern New England in the few years before the Pilgrims came. So when they came ashore at what they called Plymouth, they were basically walking into a ghost town that had been depopulated by this epidemic.
Wow.
Um, and so they could see abandoned cornfields, they could see abandoned houses in the area, they could see graves. The
Whoa.
very that's sort of a grim thing to see. I think many of them concluded that this was sort of the hand of God in preparing a place for them to settle,
Hmm.
and so they settle there. Um, Throughout these really couple of months, most of the people are still living on the ship. It doesn't just drop them off; it sort of hangs around until the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And by December, people are starting to get sick. It's probably mostly scurvy and malnutrition and exposure. And then in January, February, and March, as they're building houses, um, about a dozen people are dying a month, and there are only 102 of them to begin with. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty grim first winter.
Man, oh man. Okay. I had no idea about the, kind of the ghost town being there. What a site to walk up on and find that stuff. But I guess, like you said, they took it as a almost a good sign or something they could take over, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, and that might sound a little cruel even by our 21st century standards, but one of the things about history is recognizing that people in different times and places, they don't just think exactly the way we do.
Right.
They have their own way of looking at the world, and for them, they very much did believe in a God of providence, of God directing the events of their own lives and the events of nations and peoples. And so, what's the other explanation for why this has happened? They don't understand pathogens and disease the way that we do. They can
Right.
simply, they simply hear of this devastating plague that afflicts um, these native communities, and so that's their best way of understanding what's transpired.
Right. No, that makes sense when you frame it in that way to try to think from their perspective. So and then what were their did they have any they found this ghost town, but did they have any early interactions with, the Native Americans or the Wampanoag tribe, I guess you is what who you talked about?
They did. So when they first started exploring Cape Cod, they would see Indians on occasion who would basically make themselves scarce. And one reason for that is that other Europeans, mostly Englishmen recently, had come and sailed up and down the New England coast. And most of the time they wanted to trade, but there were a few English ship captains who kidnapped natives and took them back to Europe.
Nice.
One of them had just in about 6 years earlier had kidnapped 27 Wampanoags, including some from the what became the Plymouth site.
Oh,
And he'd taken them to Spain and sold them as slaves. So, the Indians had really good reason to be wary of folks from England.
yeah.
And so, they kept pretty scarce. And um, at present day Eastham, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, um, a group of um, a group of natives attacked them one morning. It wasn't a very serious attack. It was more sort of a warning skirmish. Nobody was seriously hurt.
Hmm.
I think the natives, they were thinking about how to respond. On the one hand, they knew these people were dangerous. On the other hand, it was a sort of a different looking group because of the women and children who were along, which
Right.
they probably hadn't seen that before. And the Wampanoag sachem or chief, Usamiquin, when he sized up the situation, he knew that his people and really his leadership had been weakened by this epidemic. And so he thought instead of attacking the Pilgrims, it would be much better to make peace with them and sort of recruit them as allies,
Yeah.
because that'd be good for his people after um, these years of death.
Right. Yeah. Do you know what the Wampanoag were kind of thinking of, all these people dying? Did they have any idea of what was causing that?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, it's sort of hard because you can only get to their perspectives through the English sources at the
Sure.
time.
Right.
Um, so not really, except you can just imagine. Well, we can't really imagine just how wrenching that would be as a society. We might know about, say, the Black Plague in Europe. Say back in the 1300s with a third to half of the European population dying. That would be sort of the closest parallel. Just complete devastation. It's sort of remarkable that um, the the native communities of this region, they really don't totally fall apart. That leader that I mentioned, Usamiquin, he's sort of able to maintain his leadership during this time. The pilgrims sometimes tell the natives, we can direct sickness. Like the sickness comes from God, maybe, but we can direct it where we want.
Yeah,
But
of
I don't,
course.
I don't know that I don't know that the natives buy that or not. Um, I mean, you can find instances in which, because there really are waves of sickness that hit different places throughout the 17th century, and you can find examples of native communities um, embracing Christianity, in part because their traditional spiritual responses to sickness and death haven't worked, and they think, well, maybe it would be good to give the God of the English a try, sort
Yeah,
of.
it's
So
reasonable.
that kind of you kind of find that happen actually throughout history with some frequency in lots of different contexts. But a short answer to your question is no. We really don't know exactly how they experienced this wrenching period of their history.
Yeah, I could imagine it would just be so devastating and scary to not really know too. Um, okay, so this, the story that we're taught in grade school is kind of the Pilgrims come over on the Mayflower and they see the Native Americans there and they're all they make peace and then they have the Thanksgiving. Is there some truth to that?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. So, the idea of a first Thanksgiving is a little bit dodgy if you mean by that sort of a formal day of Thanksgiving that the Pilgrims understood in such terms. What happens, and there's really only one source that documents this. There's one letter written by a Mayflower passenger
Wow.
by a man named Edward Winslow. And Winslow writes that, after they had gotten in a good harvest in the late summer, early fall of 1621, the governor of the colony decided that they should, after a more special manner, rejoice together. And so he sent some men out to shoot fowl, as the letter says,
Uh-huh.
and they had a lot of success. They shot a lot of ducks, geese, maybe turkey, because Bradford does mention that there were turkey um,
Okay.
in the area, and they shot enough to feed themselves for a whole week. And they had recreations. In other words, they did things to have fun, including firing their guns. So they probably had shooting contests of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, it's just the colonists. But the Wampanoags hear the colonists firing their guns, and they send 90 men to see what's going on. Maybe, they have made this alliance with the Pilgrims. Maybe they're wanting to see if their new allies are under attack. Maybe they want to see if they're up to no good. We don't really know.
Yeah.
And when Usamiquin and his men show up, um, he sends some of his men to shoot deer. They're also very successful. Game must have been very abundant around there in 1621.
Right.
And then they feasted together for a few days. And I think in a way it sort of cemented this alliance. And according to Winslow's letter, the two peoples, sort of enjoyed the moment. I'm sure they were still wary of each other, but it was a good time for
Mm-hmm.
both sides. So that doesn't really accord with what you probably learned in elementary school. It's not as if the two peoples decided to have a Thanksgiving feast together. It sort of just happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I still think it's much better to be feasting together than fighting each other.
Right. Yeah.
And so there is something worth holding on to out of that moment.
Yeah. No, that's fairly close to the story I learned. So that's nice to hear that, I got some accuracy maybe. Um, and maybe even they ate turkey. That's awesome.
Yeah, no cranberries or pumpkin pie though.
Right. No canned cranberries for them, huh?
Yeah.
Um, okay, well that's great. And then I guess how did this kind of, turn into a holiday then? Did it happen every year after that, or what's the story on that?
So the Pilgrims, they would really not have liked the idea of having a set annual day of Thanksgiving. Their style was if there was an unusual blessing, they would proclaim a day of Thanksgiving. People would go to church, spend maybe 3 hours in church, um, singing psalms, praying, listening to a sermon, and then you might have a nice meal afterwards. And if there was a military victory, that would be a reason to have a day of Thanksgiving. There'd been a big conflict in the church and it was resolved, you might have a day of Thanksgiving. It didn't occur to the Pilgrims that this harvest celebration in 1621 was a particularly of significance in a way that should be commemorated that way. And it's really not until the mid 19th century that Americans start thinking of this as a first Thanksgiving, using that name to describe it and linking it to the Pilgrims. You can certainly find, with increasing frequency, a late November day of Thanksgiving in the early United States. George Washington, in his first year as president, he proclaims the day of Thanksgiving. I think it's on the fourth Thursday of November, but at least it's around then.
Hmm.
But it has nothing to do with the Pilgrims. It's just that Americans should thank God for the establishment of their country and their victory in, the recent war against the British. But then over time, this idea of a first Thanksgiving linked to the Pilgrims becomes attractive, not just to New Englanders, but to Americans as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense. How it just kind of evolved into what it is. Okay, so the colonists are kind of there. It seems like, have they, once they've kind of gotten through that first year and they have this peace treaty with the Wampanoag, are they starting to succeed a little bit, to prosper?
Plymouth is not a rip roaring success.
Okay.
They sort of do okay. There's some other boatloads of people who join the colony. They're basically, they went, they were able to go because they got backing from some English investors. And those investors expected them to send over furs, mostly beaver.
Mm.
And sort of eventually, after 7 years, the settlers and the investors were supposed to divvy up the profits. But after 7 years, there weren't any profits. And things in terms of the fur trade got a little bit better in the 1630s, so maybe about a dozen years after the Mayflower. But Plymouth doesn't really become, doesn't enjoy fabulous prosperity. In fact, a few years later, some of the colonists sail north to what's now Boston, and they see that region around the Charles River there, and think, well, maybe we should have settled up this way. The land down around Plymouth and Cape Cod, it's not super fertile, and Plymouth Plymouth remains its own colony for 70 years or so until 1691. And it really ends up being surrounded by larger and more prosperous colonies. Massachusetts Bay is the colony to its north, and then Rhode Island and Connecticut to its west. Plymouth remains, relatively small, middling prosperity, and this doesn't sound too exciting.
Yeah.
That it's not an easy path in terms of developing the colony.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, that's understandable. I'm sure it's hard as hell to do that. I can't do it.
Yeah.
Um, and then so the reason they really came was kind of for their religious liberties. Were they Did they find what they were looking for in terms of that?
Well, they did, and so I think it's worth it to take just a little bit of time and think about what religious liberty, or Christian liberty, as they probably would have called it, meant to these people. It didn't mean that they wanted to found a colony in which there would be religious liberty for any religious options. They wanted to found a colony in which they could establish at first one church and then churches according to their principles.
Okay.
And that's pretty common in the 17th century. Most Europeans think there should be one established religious option. And they disagree about how much toleration should be extended to heretics, basically, those who aren't going along with the majority. And Plymouth actually takes sort of a middle of the road approach. They don't force anyone to join their church. In
Oh, okay.
fact, they wouldn't have wanted anyone to join their church necessarily, not unless they were, well qualified to do so. They didn't.
Right.
It wasn't like an all comers sort of membership policy. Um, and so there's a lot of conflict when folks with other religious principles come to Plymouth, whether those others were Baptists, um, Church of England, or Quakers. There's a ton of conflict with Quakers. Massachusetts hanged 4 Quakers in the late 1650s and early 1660s. And Plymouth persecuted them as well, but not as severely. So if you think about the 17th century, you have Rhode Island, which is established by a man named Roger Williams, who was basically a dissenter in both Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. And Williams really does believe in liberty for all. No state church, people can worship as they like. That doesn't
Okay.
mean he liked. It doesn't mean he liked all of them, but basically he would leave people alone.
Sure.
Massachusetts Bay had a pretty strict church establishment, and Plymouth was sort of in the middle of those two approaches.
Okay. So they, yeah, I mean, well, that's kind of the irony is that they left because they wanted to practice their what they thought was correct, but then I don't know, it just from my perspective, I guess in today's terms, it's just so ironic that they would leave and do essentially the same thing that they were leaving for.
Yeah, and many people pointed out that irony at the time. Most of those people would have wanted to persecute them. Like not a lot of people were okay with, um, you know, the later American ideal of complete separation between church and state and more or less, complete religious freedom.
Yeah.
Um, so it's easy for us to say, well, they were hypocritical, but they never had said we want to establish, a place where you can have a bunch of different churches. They basically wanted to transplant their church um, from the Dutch Republic to a colony. And for them, that would preserve their Christian liberty. That's really what they wanted.
Okay.
And then other folks start showing up. Or actually, some of the passengers on the Mayflower even had different points of view. They were sort of along for the ride. They didn't necessarily have the exact same religious principles, and so yeah, necessarily you get a lot of conflict along the way.
Yeah, it seems almost inevitable that you would have conflict with that, but their thought was just, well, we just want to do our thing, so we're going to go and have our thing here, but it's only for
Right.
us kind of. We're not going to be letting other people in. It's just us here. That's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, and so they would sort of be willing to let other people in as long as they sort of kept their mouths shut about alternative religious beliefs. Um, and the crazy thing is that by the standards of the early 1600s, they're actually pretty, they permit a fair amount of toleration. So
Hmm.
most of the time they don't make people attend church. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Um, they, you could, if you showed up with a different point of view and just sort of lived on the margins somewhere in Plymouth Colony, you could kind of do your own thing and sort of be left to yourself. But if you wanted to walk down the streets of Plymouth and start telling people that the town of Plymouth's minister has it all wrong, or you wanted to start your own religious meeting, well, that you couldn't do that. Then
Yeah.
you quickly were going to get into trouble. And a lot of the other groups that I mentioned, especially the Quakers, that was their MO. They would show up places and like publicly denounce the other churches and other ministers. And, we have the idea today of Quakers sitting around in silence and like, well, why would anybody persecute them? But back in the 1650s, 1660s, they weren't very silent. And
Right.
so they quickly got into a lot of hot water.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of fair. I can understand their perspective where, just you can live here, but just kind of keep quiet. But once you start yelling in the streets, then it's, get the hell out of here. So,
That is more or less the approach, which that doesn't accord with what most Americans today think of about the Pilgrims, because Americans
yeah,
think of the Pilgrims as um, people who came for religious liberty, but they, we tend to put that in, our own terms rather than think about what this meant back then.
yeah. Yeah, that is important to kind of to try to get into the mindset and beliefs and motivations of them back then. So that's great that we're kind of diving into that. I appreciate that. And that's also something that is not I feel like it wasn't impressed upon me was the importance of the motivation for the colonists and for really Plymouth and everything was so motivated by religious liberty and religion. I didn't realize that that had so much to do with the story, but that's really the driving force, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, as I said, they did want more prosperity than they'd had in the Dutch Republic.
Okay.
So Winslow, the same passenger who wrote that account of Thanksgiving that I mentioned, he talked about his desire for Plymouth to be a place where religion and profit jumped together. Those were his words. But there's no question that their understanding of Christian liberty was absolutely of prime importance to the very reason why this colony got started. I mean, if they had not had those complaints about the Church of England, if they hadn't separated from it, they hadn't been persecuted for it, these were not the sort of individuals who were going to leave England to start a colony.
Hmm.
They would have simply lived out their lives in their English towns and villages, and you and I would not have heard of these folks.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Um, okay, and then so I'm intrigued by the kind of the interactions with the Native Americans there and everything. So they initially had the kind of the peace treaty with the Wampanoag, but did those relationships start to erode over time?
So yeah, they did, as you can imagine. So the Wampanoag sachem Usamiquin, who forms this alliance with the Pilgrims. So he and his most immediate people, they live about 40 miles to the west of Plymouth. So if you think about it from his perspective, these 100 or so Englishmen, men and women, settling at this depopulated place that they call Plymouth, that's not much of a threat to him.
Yeah, sure.
And why would he have foreseen that 20 years later, there would be 20,000 English settlers in New England? That would have been just unimaginable to him. So during the early period of Plymouth Colony, that Wampanoag English alliance really works for both sides. The Plymouth colonists, they do throw their weight around a bit in the region, more so against other native peoples to the north. And if anything, that probably strengthens the position of the Wampanoag vis-a-vis their traditional enemies.
Hmm.
But then what happens, especially a couple of decades down the road, is you get very large numbers of English settlers coming, not first and foremost to Plymouth, although some come to Plymouth, but coming to Massachusetts Bay and then Connecticut. And so the English population starts to expand quickly, and over time really encroach on Wampanoag communities. Uh, First, sort of heading west toward Rhode Island, but then also east onto Cape Cod.
Mhm.
And that totally changes this relationship. It quickly becomes apparent that the English no longer feel any need to treat the Wampanoags with respect. They desire more and more land. Um, there are all sorts of deeds of land purchases, which makes everything sort of seem on the up and up.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of coercion, confusion, and swindling, I think, in some of those land purchases.
Sure.
So, 40 years or so after the establishment of the colony, this alliance is seriously fraying. And then Lusamikwen's son, Metacom, whom the English call Philip, he really revolts against Plymouth and against the English more generally in the 1670s. And it leads to an extremely devastating war, um, most commonly called King Philip's War,
Yeah.
and that starts in 1675. And it's pretty devastating actually for a lot of English communities all across New England. There's a lot of communities that are burned, attacked. But in the end, the English prevail, partly because some of the Indians side with them.
Hmm.
And so it ends up being um, just almost as bad as those years of the epidemic that we talked about earlier. For some of those Wampanoag communities, especially in the western part of Plymouth, they are conquered, they are enslaved, they are in some cases shipped out of New England and sold across the ocean.
Jeez.
So it's sort of a dismal and dreary end to that story.
Yeah. So why you mentioned that some of the Native Americans would join the colonists, the English. Why was that? Just kind of as a, better do that than die, essentially?
I think sometimes, yes. There were certainly Wampanoag communities by that point that had uh, embraced Christianity, and I think that did actually create some, you know, connection with the English. Generally, though, it is those Wampanoag communities that are closer to English settlements and probably have had the squeeze put on them.
Mm.
Um, you know, talking about Wampanoag communities at this time, it's not it's not like talking about the nation state of England. It is actually sort of a loose confederation, and so you have different communities certainly pursuing their own self-interest and affiliations. So that's not a great answer to your question. I think you're probably actually hit on it. Um, maybe it's to our advantage to side with the English, and the English are keeping really pretty close tabs on those communities that are closer to Plymouth and their other large towns. So you're right. There's sort of limited choices.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. It seems logical that that's what it would sort of be. And then how was the were there I'm just curious on like a practical level, kind of how did communication work between, like the Wampanoag and the in English?
So that's a great question. So one thing you might have heard about in elementary school, you might have heard about Squanto,
Oh yeah,
um,
sure.
who's famous for helping the Plymouth colonists learn how best to fertilize their crops. So Squanto, and he has one of the more remarkable stories you could hear. He's one of those Wampanoags who was kidnapped in 1614 and taken to Spain to be sold as a slave. He was freed apparently due to the intervention of um, some priests, some Catholic priests in Spain, somehow made his way to England. We don't really know how. Went to Newfoundland. I think he wanted to get back home, right?
Hmm.
Ended up then going back to England, um, and then becoming part of a venture that did take him back to his community at Plymouth. By which point, everybody there almost was dead. So
Oof.
quite a story. And Um, he's not the first native man to approach the colonists, but he's on the scene pretty early. He knows how to speak English. And so the colonists heavily rely on him and a couple of other natives who have learned English through their prior contacts with English traders and explorers.
Wow.
Some of the English colonists also learn Wampanoag. Edward Winslow, who I've mentioned a couple times, he can clearly communicate in the language after a couple of years. But for the
Hmm.
most part, the colonists, they prefer to rely on native translators.
Okay. Man, well that's great to hear. Thanks for yeah, because I you would kind of assume that's what would happen, but man, that story of Squanto just he was taught English when he was over in Spain or wherever.
When he got back to England, I presume.
Okay.
Maybe he spoke some Spanish as well.
Yeah, right.
Um, so, yeah, it's just a remarkable story. And out of the 27 or so who were taken to Spain, he's the only survivor that we know about. The only one apparently who was able to make it back home.
Wow, crazy. And then so what was kind of the reason for the influx of English people coming over to North America during that time?
So, I'd mentioned that other folks were unhappy with the Church of England, and generally they were called Puritans because they wanted to further purify the Church of England. There's a real crackdown on Puritans by the church in the 1630s. And that's a significant factor in prompting um, thousands of people to leave during that decade. It's
Okay.
not the only reason. By the time, Plymouth has struggled along for a while, there is a sense that New England is a pretty good place to go because of the ready availability of land, because of
Hmm.
the fur trade. It's always been desirable in part because of things like, not always, but it had long been known as a good destination for fishing, for shipbuilding, and a few other things. So it's not only religion that is pushing people out of England. There's also certainly an economic attraction by the 1630s as well. But you have a couple of thousand people coming over pretty much every year in the 1630s. And so
Wow.
the English population grows quickly. The native population really steadily falls throughout the 1600s, first because of the epidemic, but then I think for subsequent epidemics and other reasons. So you really just have this shift in power.
Yeah. And then so what is kind of the decline or the I think guess thing that puts the nail in the coffin for Plymouth?
What really sort of puts the nail in the coffin is at they never have a charter from the crown. Now that wasn't like an ironclad guarantee that you were going to be able to keep governing yourself, but sort of there's a lot of complex English developments that I'll try to mention really quickly. So there's a civil war in England in the 1640s, and it ends with the beheading of the king. And then when the monarchy is restored in 1660. About that time, the monarchy and English officials, they begin to take more of an interest in their overseas colonies. There's a concern that folks in New England are not sufficiently loyal to the monarchy. And so there's a desire to impose sort of greater, English control. And by the time you get to the 1680s, the crown decides to invalidate the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and reorganize all of New England under a crown appointed governor. There's a
Right.
lot of resistance to this in New England.
Sure.
And then after another king is essentially overthrown, things get reorganized again. And those colonies that had charters, which included Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts Bay, they sort of remained their own colonies with greater English oversight and with crown appointed governors.
Hmm.
Plymouth had never gotten a charter to sort of provide its self-government with any sort of legality. And the crown decides to attach it to Massachusetts Bay. And, there's Plymouth might have been able to stave that off if they had like raised enough money to pay um, a bribe to the right official in England, but
Sure.
they couldn't pull that off. And so they became part of a larger Massachusetts Bay after that.
Okay, so they were just kind of absorbed into that.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow, man. So it's just kind of like a, I don't know, a clerical, thing. Let's just absorb them all together because they don't have the proper paperwork almost.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. And for a lot of folks in Plymouth, it's not a massive change. Some people are upset about it. Um, Actually, by that point, the Quakers and the Baptists, there are quite a few of them who sort of persevere in Plymouth, and they really don't like being attached to Massachusetts Bay because the Massachusetts Bay folks are going to treat them worse than Plymouth's government did.
Right. Okay. Man, well, John, this is great. I love so much this story because I feel like it's something that, I semi learned in grade school, and we heard about it for a half hour, and then we made, hats to wear or something. So it's fun to
Sure.
to revisit this, now that I'm a little older and hopefully a little smarter than I was in third grade, and I can, dive into it a bit more. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this and writing your book. It's great that we have it.
No, thanks, Travis. I had a lot of fun talking about it with you. Thanks for all your good questions.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, of course. Thank you. And your book is They Knew They Were Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony, and the Contest for American Liberty. That is anywhere specific we should send people to grab a copy of that?
Well, I mean, you could get it at, the main retailer, Amazon. There's a bunch of other places you could get it. You could get it from Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Ooh.
I'd love it if people got it there, but they could probably get it for less on Amazon. But if they got it from Pilgrim Hall gets a little bit of money from it, and it's a really special place in Plymouth. So I recommend that.
Okay. Do they have a website?
They do. I could send it to you.
Okay. Well, we'll have it in the link here or in the description for people listening to grab it from there. So, well, that's great. Is there any I don't know, imparting words or anything you'd like to impart on people listening about this story and the history of all this that maybe you know
Uh,
overlooked?
Not really. I mean, I guess one thing I'd say is, all Americans, they get reminded of the Pilgrims every November, usually in really trite ways. And the actual history, it might not always be quite as sunny and relentlessly inspiring, but it's almost inevitably more human and I think more compelling. So some of these stories that we're super familiar with, they're really worth another look so that we can learn some things beneath the surface and get a sense of the way folks, both natives and English, lived and thought 400 years ago.
Cool. Love it. Well, thanks again, John, and appreciate your time coming on, and have a good one. All right.
You got it. Thanks, Travis.